Everyone, welcome back for the final session of the California Broadband Summit, and we will roll right into the Cal Matters Ideas Festival. We have a sharp 3:45 cutoff, so we're going to get started right away. Thank you if you are still talking to move your conversations out, or stay for this exciting discussion. We are ending with net neutrality and privacy. California has taken the lead on these topics, passing their own laws on net neutrality and privacy, and yet the federal government is now ramping up its interests and discussion on this. This session will be moderated by Lai Stirland, a good friend of mine who we work together at National Journal's Tech Daily. She has gone on to work for many other great places, including Wired, Personal Democracy Media, and Politico, as well as Broadband Breakfast. And welcome to the stage and to our final discussion. Take care and welcome our guests.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. About net neutrality, which remains, I'm sorry if I'm squinting, I just really can't see anything with these lights. About net neutrality in 2024, and specifically in California in 2024. I'd like to start off by asking, and again, I really can't see anything, but Drew, could you go around and ask, can anyone define what net neutrality is today? Either on the federal level or in California?
Raise your hand if you want to define net neutrality.
Come on, someone's got to be able to do it.
Come on, here we go.
The ability to treat all data on the network the same and not charge different prices or have different priorities.
Okay, that's great. Anyone else? Anyone else have a different definition?
I was just going to say affordable internet for all.
Okay, well, that's two really interesting perspectives that...
We've got a third one here.
Yeah, okay, one more.
I thought it was that no company should have an advantage position or a preferred position, like, you know, Facebook shouldn't be able to get the better access to the internet compared to other startup companies.
Those are three really good definitions, and from three different angles. So, Barbara, you're the authority on net neutrality. Well, let me just thank you very much. Those are all correct. So, a round of applause for those three people. I just want to set the landscape right now. We're at this really fascinating juncture in time when California appears to be in the catbird seat when it comes to actually being able to enforce net neutrality rules. And we'll discuss this more as the panel gets underway. And Barbara is one of the main architects of this, so we're very lucky to have her here, as well as Geoffrey. And but the general gist is that the federal rules for net neutrality, the Federal Communications Commission enforces net neutrality. And the term, I was surprised that not more people put up their hands because we've been talking about this for at least 2 decades when I started my career in Washington, D.C. with Drew. And they're still in flux after decades of discussion and litigation. But meanwhile, the state laws, especially California's, is in effect. On the federal level, the latest news is that several telecom associations late last week, back up. The Federal Communications Commission reenacted the net neutrality laws in April, and after they were repealed under the previous administration. So it's called the Open Internet Order, I think, and it's supposed to prevent internet service providers from throttling data, from advantaging their own content over others, and blocking any content, lawful content. And there's some slight differences between California laws and federal laws, and I'm sure Barbara will give us the comprehensive lowdown, as well as Jeff. So they enacted that, they reinstated that law in April, but just last week, all these telecom providers, including the Wireless Association providers and cable and television providers on the state level, they filed a bunch of lawsuits against the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, saying that they don't have the authority to do this because they don't have the authority to categorize the internet, your ISP, as a telecom provider, which is like a telephone company, which enables them to set prices and subject the ISPs to a whole bunch of rules that they wouldn't be subject to if they were categorized as an information service, which is what they were categorized as before. So this has been going on this ping-pong litigation has been going on for literally 2 decades at least. But meanwhile, state law, as I said, has been implemented. It's been challenged, but it's still, all the challenges failed. So the fact is that California's net neutrality law remains in effect, even if the federal rule from the FCC goes away. I just was, the other thing I'd like to say is that I hope John Oliver brings back another segment on net neutrality, because hardly anyone ever talks about it. But he did, I think, a huge service when he categorized the internet as, I think it was a database of cats or something like that. But he did a marvelous segment on it years ago. Hopefully he'll do it again. So let's get to the question. After our audience defined net neutrality, Barbara, could you define what the California law says?
Yeah, so thanks, Sarah. I would not say how...
I'm sorry, I apologize. I didn't introduce the panelists. This is Barbara Van Schewick. She's the director of Stanford Law School, Center for Internet and Society, and she's been very, very involved in net neutrality legislation and authoring it and sort of testifying in all the different hearings on the state level and probably on the federal level as well. And you've been involved in creating legislation around the world, is that correct?
Yeah, so I'm a lawyer and a computer scientist. I'm a professor of law at Stanford Law School and have a courtesy appointment in electrical engineering as well. And I've worked on net neutrality for the past 24 years, basically, even before people started calling it net neutrality. And since 2007, I've been involved in all the major net neutrality debates around the world, starting with, the Comcast proceeding here, and the 2010, 2015, and now 2024 net neutrality protections at the federal level rely heavily on my work. And then in California, I served as the chief technical expert on the California net neutrality law, testified at every hearing on the bill, and also helped defend the law in court. And so, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And we also have Geoffrey Manne, Jeff, who's the president of the Center for Law and Economics in Portland, Oregon. And tell us a bit about yourself, Jeff.
Well, I've been opposing net neutrality bills since a little bit later than Barbara, since about 2010, 2009, I guess. I mean, it's really been an incredibly long time that we've been having these debates, and they don't change that much, which is sort of infuriating about them. It will be interesting to talk about California in particular, for example. That's something a little bit different than the federal debates that I've been involved in. I will just say one other thing. I am from Oregon, and usually it's Californians coming up to Oregon, and we're annoyed that they do. And so I feel like it's a great opportunity for Oregon to come to California and carpetbag a little bit, talk about your laws, tell you about how you did it wrong, that sort of thing. So,
thank you.
So.
Okay. So, Barbara, can you define net neutrality for us?
Yeah, so listening to all of you define net neutrality made me think of the story about the elephant. And you probably know the story of the blind man and the elephant. Everybody's touching the elephant and someone's like, oh, it feels like a trunk, and no, it feels like a big wall. And it's because the blind men are touching different pieces of the elephant. And so, you said net neutrality is about blocking and throttling and no paid fast lanes. And I usually use a broader definition. So my definition is that net neutrality is the principle that we, the people who use the internet, should be able to determine what we do online. So we should be able to determine what sites to visit, what videos to watch, what apps to use. And the broadband internet providers, the companies that connect us to the internet, should not be able to interfere with our choices. And then if you think about all the different ways in which that could happen, they could block our access to websites or apps and then they don't work, or they could slow down what we are doing or speed it up. All of that fits really nicely within that overall definition. And so the one thing I would say in response to the audience suggestions, that when you open up the newspaper and people say net neutrality is the principle that, most people say it means you need to treat every data packet the same. And what's really interesting is we haven't used that definition since the early 2000s, because that kind of definition, treating everything the same, would actually rule out a whole bunch of innovation. And so I'm sure we'll talk more about that later. But that's part of why we don't generally say you have to treat everything the same.
Okay.
Can I add something? Or I won't dispute. I think that's accurate. I think it's, though, very important to note, at least with respect to the federal net neutrality legislation, or excuse me, rules. The fundamental issue that we're debating in that context is the legal authority to impose the rules. It's not so much, it is also the content of the net neutrality rules, but I think it's important to note that there's another aspect of it, the aspect, in fact, that's most relevant to the challenges that you suggested the ISPs had just filed. So I just want to point out that there is net neutrality. There has been some, it's changed a little bit, but it's been pretty consistent for 20-ish years. There is also this question of Title II, you may have heard of, right? Title II of the Communications Act and the FCC's authority to...
Yeah, that's the rule that treats the ISPs like a telephone company.
Right, but it does so much more.
Right.
So much so that well, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. I really just wanted to put that note in there because there's a difference between the two. One can be opposed, for example, to Title II, to reclassifying broadband under Title II, and support net neutrality at the same time.
Because?
Because they're not the same thing. Right. Net neutrality are these principles, no blocking, no throttling, no paid prioritization. Right. Title II is the mechanism by which the FCC is trying to impose those common carriage-like obligations on broadband providers.
Okay.
Those are two different things. It is worth noting, it's interesting that they're two very different things because it's one indication that Title II is not really made for the purpose for which it's trying to be used, the imposition of these telecommunications standards on what is, in my view, manifestly an information service. We know that because in order to use Title II to impose net neutrality regulations on broadband providers, the FCC has to cobble together the authority from a bunch of different places in the statute. It forbears from imposing a great number of the rules that are part of Title II. Title II is meant to govern a certain type of service, and it has a whole bunch of rules that are to apply to those services. In order to make it apply to broadband providers without destroying the ability to offer broadband, the FCC has to forbear from imposing a good number of those rules. Now, that Barbara will say, and she's absolutely right, that doesn't mean that there isn't authority, that you can't, in fact, use this statute and tailor it the way you want to fit here. I just want to, I'm saying this right now to make my point, which I thought would be unobjectionable, but I see Barbara looking over, which is net neutrality and Title II are not the same thing, and there are different questions involved. We can talk about the economics and the policy issues around net neutrality, but if you're going to talk about Title II, we can also talk about economics and policy issues, but we're also going to be talking about legal and constitutional issues that are not inherently part of the net neutrality debate.
Yeah,
okay.
so
hang on for a sec. Sorry. So I'm just wondering, I'd really like to make this useful for the audience. So I'm just wondering, in terms of having this discussion be useful, are most people here in the legislature? Are you at ISPs? What angle are you particularly interested in? Because there are just so many angles we could take this from.
Right.
Is there anyone out there who can...
Over here. Maybe ask a question.
Yeah.
Well, you know, get them to raise their hands.
I want to focus this.
Hi.
Okay. Well,
Hi, Randy Leaning with Broadband Toolkit, and I don't have any position per se, but I do have a question, and that is oftentimes when net neutrality is discussed, one of the ingredients that sort of leads to some pushback is sort of in places where data is being delivered over a network where the cost is not zero. And an example would be satellite or say terrestrial broadband, where if you had a, in which case sort of the idea of a third party, subsidizing some of that cost might become a component. So anyway, I'm hoping that you guys will speak to that as an area of interest.
okay, well, thank you so much. What's your name? Sorry?
Randy.
Thanks so much for that, Randy. So Barbara, first of all, we can get to that, but why don't you respond to Jeff's point?
So are you thinking about if you have a satellite provider, should someone else help subsidize the costs of providing the connection to the end user customer other than the ISP? So just so that we understand the question.
Sure. Well, just that, for instance, if you have a satellite provider, that provider is going to be very sensitive to bandwidth because it's super expensive. Versus with fiber, like I have a 10 gig, fiber connection at home. I could use an infinite amount, and my ISP will be very generous, but it's not going to cost them a lot. But versus if I had satellite, it would. And so, to me, that's a practical issue.
Yeah. So the answer to that is really simple, which is. Net neutrality protections apply, at least in the United States, to all the all the internet service providers who provide, mass market service to normal end user customers and small businesses and startups. So for those, the net neutrality protections are the same for all internet service providers. Having said that, there are exceptions to net neutrality, in particular one for reasonable network management. And that says, in general, you need to comply with net neutrality when you manage your network. But if that is not possible, given the technology in your network, then you can be more intrusive, but so you need to be as non-discriminatory as possible. And so I know during this round of the net neutrality proceeding, the satellite providers filed comments, asking for some blanket exceptions, and the FCC said, that is really not necessary because our reasonable network management exception is very clear that characteristics of the technology will be used in figuring out whether there are times where you have to be more discriminatory than we would allow for, let's say, a fiber network.
So I'm glad that we're discussing this right now, because one of the reasons I wanted to ask the audience what they wanted to hear about is because one of the arguments we've heard over the years from telecom providers is that they don't want to implement net neutrality because it's a costly imposition, and it wouldn't, if you're going to get universal service out to everyone, net neutrality shouldn't be imposed on them. That's an argument that I've heard.
Yeah, so I mean, my thoughts on that is, first, often we actually actively subsidize broadband, the provision of broadband to areas where it's very costly to provide. And there, even more so than in the other areas, the argument that if we pay a lot of money as a society in order to connect everyone to this critical infrastructure, then of course it's really critical that that infrastructure is, how we can use that infrastructure is determined by us, the people who use the infrastructure. And so that's one. It would make no sense to say we are making the internet less useful by getting rid of net neutrality protections, which have basically governed the internet since the inception of the internet in the United States. So getting rid of net neutrality would make the internet less useful, and we would do that to get people more of something that's less useful. And Tim Wu had this really nice phrase about that. It's like selling the picture to get a better frame. So,
Tim Wu's a law professor at Columbia, by the way.
Yeah, and someone who, is widely credited with coming up with the term net neutrality. The other thing I would say is, and we saw that in California when we were talking about getting the net neutrality law through the legislature, there is a real division between the large internet service providers like the Comcasts and AT&Ts and Verizons of the world on the one hand, and then smaller ISPs on the other. And both in during the legislative process and also in the litigation, many of the smaller ISPs filed declarations or testified in the legislature saying, we are absolutely fine running our networks in a net neutrality friendly way. That's the default way in which all the network equipment is set up. And so it's not costly, and they were actually arguing that having no net neutrality disadvantages the smaller providers. So it is not the case that ISPs generally say this is so costly, we shouldn't have net neutrality.
Okay, so there seems to be an area of agreement between you two?
No, that's actually a good example of why the difference between the way the rules are implemented and the concept behind net neutrality matters. To the extent net neutrality has been the governing principle of the internet since the beginning, it has obviously been without the imposition of 500 pages of rules by the FCC, because those didn't come into existence really until 2015, but in the net neutrality sense. There's been some version of them since 2010, but actually all of the ISPs, I believe the small ones, but certainly the big ones, would be happy with going back to the 2010 sort of standards, which really were the net neutrality kind of principles, and basically said, do this stuff. And now, however, because there was legal problems with imposing that under Title I, the FCC had to resort to Title II. And the problem is, the reason the ISPs are, I don't know of any ISPs that want to do blocking or throttling. There are no very good examples. There's
oh, wait, hold on, sorry. I don't think that's true, though.
It is true.
I mean,
there's like one example in history of an ISP blocking.
It depends what your definition of an ISP is, though, right? I mean,
maybe. What are you thinking of?
Well, I think in 2024, you could say that a network provider is a wireless provider in addition to being a regular cable provider, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure what you're saying.
Said they wanted an exception from net neutrality for 5G, so that would qualify.
For 5G? Yeah. For network slicing.
Yeah.
Right, which is a form of network management, which, as you said, reasonable network management is fine. I mean, I don't think they're asking for, I think they're asking for the application of reasonable network management principles to new technology that facilitates management of broadband better.
They said
I know that you don't think
hold
that.
on. So I think this is where it breaks down. Is that? Did you have a question?
I was just going to ask. I mean, I'm just going to say to myself.
Here, let's get your microphone.
I don't really need it.
Yeah.
My wife would say, no problem, he'll hear him. I don't know, personally, I'm not that interested in a debate about whether they're standing or whatever the legal status of ISPs are. I'm kind of more interested in the title of this session, which was Net Neutrality and Privacy, and I'm really curious what that theme was about. and what that thesis was, or idea. Thank you.
All right.
Our understanding was that they were separate. There is some overlap between them, but not a lot, I think, right? And
I think.
But Drew, you can tell us.
Yes,
you probably
Drew,
wrote the title. It seemed to us
the
that there was net neutrality, there was privacy. We were putting them into the same panel, not entirely combining them. Is that correct? I don't know if that's correct or not.
You're asking the organizer to step in. Look, I think that at the end of the day, we're going to have privacy and net neutrality legislation. Whether we get there by some sausage-making process or not, you know, there's more agreement around privacy right now than around net neutrality. But I mean, maybe if I can throw in a question
on that one too. So.
Well, let me throw in a question for you all, which is there any sense that it would be better for Congress to pass net neutrality than to have a ping pong where every administration goes back and forth at the FCC on net neutrality?
Jeff, why don't you go?
That fundamentally goes to the question that's at issue in the challenge to the net neutrality rules. And again, I hate to keep harping on it, the actual standard and authority by which the FCC can do this. So if Congress wanted to impose net neutrality rules, it wouldn't have to go through all this rigmarole, right? It could, it never has authorized it, and again, that's the issue. Congress could say net neutrality is the law of the land, no blocking, no throttling, no paid prioritization, and you know, cabin the ways in which the FCC could enforce those rules. If it did that, there would be no legal challenge to the imposition of net neutrality rules by the FCC. There would be no ping-ponging because Congress would have spoken. Congress is allowed to speak. By the way, I should have made this clear earlier too. The reason it's an issue with respect to the FCC is that the FCC is not a democratically elected body. It's a part of the executive branch. It's an independent agency. It has to do, it only is allowed to do what Congress gives it the authority to do. So there's lots of questions about what exactly the scope of that authority is. Right now, we happen to be in a sort of constitutional moment in which there's a lot of incentive to restrict that authority, to take a pretty constrained view of what kind of authority the FCC has, or at least there appears to be a movement in that direction. We don't know for sure what the Supreme Court's going to do right now, but there's reason to think that the FCC may not have the authority under the Constitution to do what it wants to do right now. If Congress did it, though, no question, it would be done.
Okay,
Yeah, so
well, that brings me back to Barbara, and because while the federal government and the FCC and the telecom companies fight each other, California has a law that is not being challenged. Well, it's not being challenged right now. It was challenged.
So I think there are two ways to answer this question. One is the ideal world, and one is the world we actually live in. So in an ideal world where we could just get Congress to adopt meaningful net neutrality protections, yeah, that would be awesome. Having said that, part of the problem with net neutrality is that there are all these different ways in which an internet service provider can interfere with user choice. And while the broadband providers since, let's say, 2017 have been very vocal saying, we love net neutrality, we just don't want the FCC to do it, and we love net neutrality, but we also don't want California to do it. When it comes down to it, they fight heavily over the actual shape of the rules. And so my sense of the ISP proposals that I've seen is basically it's the Swiss cheese version of net neutrality. So many holes that there isn't a lot of net neutrality left. And that is what we have seen over and over, both in the United States and around the world. And so for those of you who were here in 2017, 2018, when we were doing net neutrality, it was a huge fight. You know, the broadband providers made it their national priority to kill the net neutrality law. They spent more than $6 billion according to Politico to kill it, hired every contract lobbyist in the building, and placed robocalls to senior citizens saying that if net neutrality was adopted, then it would, their bill would go up by $30 to $50, which was not accurate.
A month.
And so, per month, yeah. And so it was a miracle, you know, where lots of Californians called the legislature, lots of groups fought for this law, and the legislature listened. But it was very unusual that this law was passed with all the protections intact. And the problem with net neutrality is one loophole is sufficient to make the whole protections meaningless. And so that's what I'm saying in terms of the realistic world that we live in, that while the broadband providers love saying they love net neutrality, they don't actually agree what good net neutrality looks like.
Okay, so since you're so involved in helping the California law go forward and be made law, could you just broadly define for the average person, we know some of what it does, but for a user, an end user, what does it mean, and how does it, and for entrepreneurs or anyone else, how does it affect them?
Yeah, it basically protects their internet access service as a service where they can determine what they want to do with the internet. So that's one. That translates into your internet service provider is not allowed to block access to websites. It's not allowed to speed up or slow down certain sites or apps or kinds of apps, and thereby give some apps an advantage over others. One thing that was very important in 2015, you know, broadband providers are not allowed to offer fast lanes to companies like Netflix that would let Netflix's data come, like videos come to customers with better performance, and that's one of the things that's really critical for entrepreneurs. That, you know, as many of you know, many of the most important and most popular apps were developed by people in their garage or students or people without a lot of money, and net neutrality does protect the ability to develop new applications at low cost and then get to people on the same terms and conditions as everybody else.
And I'm sorry to be repetitive, but you know, when you say net neutrality allows people to access things that they want to do, and there's no discrimination. For example, an internet service provider can't provide their own content for free and not charge you for it, but then charge their competitor a fee. What about, but if I were a consumer and I wanted to try a new video calling service on my wireless network, and if Verizon or whoever wants to charge me an extra fee, like $5 a month for this, I mean, just because someone's charging me more money or charging someone else more money doesn't mean they're blocking them, right? I mean, you can still do what you want to do, but you just have to pay for it.
So, but the key idea is broadband providers have their own motivations. They are rightly, you know, profit-making companies, and they are interested in maximizing their profits.
Right.
And that doesn't necessarily make for the best decisions in terms of what they give you access to. So if I want to try a new video calling service under net neutrality, I just can, because I bought broadband and I can use it. And my ISP cannot prevent me from doing that. So I'm thinking, I'm not maybe understanding the setup of your question. Why do I need to pay extra to use a calling service that with net neutrality I can just use how I want?
Well, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I don't know, I can ask, I guess, the audience even, has anyone, up until 2015 and then after 2018, 2015 to 2018 is when we had the only period in which we had federal Title II net neutrality rules. And then, of course, California adopted its own in that same period. Has anyone tried to do anything on the internet and been blocked by their ISP or not able to perform some task or reach some website that's legal that your ISP said you can't, sorry, you can't?
Someone's raising their hand, so you asked a question.
Yeah, so I'm Steve Milton with Gigabit Now, and we're actually an internet service provider in the Seattle and in Southern California. And the primary example that I would have of that is with Comcast peering relationships with Netflix.
Yeah.
They would intentionally under-provision their peering relationships with large popular services in order to make it so that those services performed poorly in comparison to cable on the local system.
Except, I mean, my
So
understanding is though that
what peering is to
wouldn't
people?
be affected by the net neutrality.
Oh,
rules.
yes, absolutely.
They have their own. They have contracts with them now, and I know that they didn't at first, but they have contracts now that are either they will be prohibited by the net neutrality rules because they get what someone might deem favorable service. It seems to me like that is a potential problem. It's a commercial issue relating to two commercial entities that they worked out pretty well.
So I was actually really excited that you brought this up because I think the story you are telling is one that almost everyone in this room will have experienced, but most people will have no idea that it was related to net neutrality. And so from 2012 to 2015, the 6th largest broadband providers in the country, Comcast, Time Warner, AT&T, Verizon, CenturyLink, they had decided that they wanted to charge for access to their customers. And so they went out to the larger content providers and said, hey, pay us for the privilege of us transporting your data packets to, let's say if you're Comcast, to Comcast broadband customers.
Your data packets, which constitute
let me
like 50%
maybe just
of the content?
finish. So originally these companies said, no, why should we pay you? And also the 2010 net neutrality protections which were in place at that time do prohibit that. You know, they say if I'm buying internet access, I'm getting access to the internet, and that includes the right to send what I want to and from the internet. And so the ISP shouldn't allow to be paid twice for that service. Turns out when these companies refused to pay, then these 6 providers said, well, we'll make you pay by letting the doors into their network congest. And said, if you want to have good quality interconnection, then you can pay us extra. And in the 2010 net neutrality protections, that wasn't covered by the rules. And that's what I was trying to say to you before, that there are all these different ways in which you can get around net neutrality. And so we saw in 2012 that the best rules don't help you if they don't apply to the point where data enters your network. So from 2012 to 2015, for many people in the United States, this were like 75% of Americans, the applications and data that came in through these congested connections stopped working. So many people noticed when they couldn't watch the 2nd season of House of Cards, which was dropping at the time, but it was people couldn't do voice calls, schools couldn't upload their payroll data, games stopped working in the evening. And it was really random and hard for people to make sense of because Google, Microsoft, Amazon, they had started to pay. So if you went to Google's website or to Facebook's website, it worked great. But then Netflix would stutter and break up. And so people are like, clearly Netflix isn't working, I should get rid of my Netflix connection. And that only stopped for those companies that started to pay, which Netflix did in February of 2014. And companies like the company that did League of Legends, they started paying. But then for all the others, it only stopped in 2015 when the net neutrality protections that the FCC adopted then said, you are not allowed to circumvent net neutrality at the point where data enters your network. That was all they said, and that's what made it stop.
Does that you mean it applies to peering?
It applied, absolutely.
Right. So wait, hold on.
Say, yeah.
Sorry, Jeff, can I just ask one thing? So this, I'm sorry, what was your name again? Steve, so do you think under California law, let's focus back on the California law, what is that a net neutrality violation?
Yeah, and under the 2015 and 2024 protections as well, they say, first, you cannot charge application or content providers for access to your customers, and you cannot circumvent net neutrality through interconnection at the point where data enters your network. And these two rules together in 2015 were understood to make it impossible to let your connections into the network congest in order to force people to pay.
What about co-location? Is that also captured? So Netflix now puts its servers in the ISP's networks directly, and I believe they pay for that. Is that?
So first, I don't think Netflix pays for anything,
They may
but
not. It may
let's just keep it big picture,
It doesn't
which
matter
is
whether
the
they pay
net
or not.
neutrality law in California says, one, you cannot charge content providers for access to your customers, and two, you cannot circumvent net neutrality for interconnection.
But you can give them a
hold
priority.
on.
So-
Let me just, that means for every single practice, you need to ask, is that a circumvention? That's what the 2015 rules said. That would be up to the FCC to determine at the federal level, and to the California Attorney General to determine at the state level. And we all know that in 2015, when these rules took effect, all the large ISPs came to the table and resolved these problems, and things started working again.
Okay, real quick, we're about to get the hook. But my last question is, if there was a violation of net neutrality rules in California, how can, should Rob Bonta jump in there and enforce the rule, sue Comcast?
I mean, we don't know what Comcast is doing right now. Part of why it's important to have an expert agency in this space is that these kinds of contracts are confidential, and it's very hard for people to understand, like, if my, Amazon Video, Amazon Prime Video, or my Netflix doesn't work, is it because there is congestion? Is it because of these disputes? I can only tell you that as part of the net neutrality proceeding that just happened, that companies like Lumen and others filed comments that say these kinds of problems that we had between 2012 and 2015, and that stopped when we had federal net neutrality protections in place, they have been coming back, and that's part of why we need net neutrality. And
So-
we wouldn't really know because we only notice that some stuff works and some stuff doesn't. And if there is a problem, then then the California Attorney General, just as much as the FCC, should look into it, but I don't know what's happening in the network right now. So it's hard for me to say, like, yay, let's do something.
Well, I'm just wondering how it can be enforced. It just sounds as if it's impossible to enforce if there are all these private contractual agreements.
Well, the enforcing agency can ask for data and investigate if there are indications that there is a problem.
Okay, well, with that, thank you so much to the panelists. Please give them a round of, oh, there's one question from the audience, another question from the audience.
Advocating a digital EPA.
That's really interesting, a digital EPA.
Can you elaborate?
EPA. It sounds like that would be maybe something that could monitor net neutrality, especially if shenanigans like that's going on.
I mean, that's why we have an expert agency that, was powerless to do anything about this until now. And the rules are going to take effect July 22nd. And so that will put the FCC in a position where it can start monitoring net neutrality.
So, Sarah, we do have to give, let's give both of our panelists a chance to respond to one last quick question.
Actually, all I wanted to do is see if we can get what Geoffrey was trying to say said. I know that he had a response earlier, but didn't have the opportunity.
Sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
So many responses. I mean, does anyone think that Netflix shouldn't have to pay anything to ISPs to get its content to, which I think by itself consumes something like 30% of overall bandwidth, maybe it's higher. Right. I mean, I get that there are some people who'd think that, but the consequence of that is, of course, the customers have to subsidize, the customers who don't use Netflix or don't use as much content are effectively subsidizing the ones who do. And maybe that's a policy that we want to adopt, but I just don't think it's so clearly, so obviously the only way to operate the internet. With respect to the kinds of things we might worry about, like ideological-based blocking, or some sort of a pernicious kind of, not a commercial dispute that gets resolved and there's a contract entered into, but some sort of an effort to constrain what users can actually access on the internet. There's vanishingly few, maybe 2 examples of anything even like it ever happening, and they aren't even really good examples. That's not to say they couldn't, of course they could, but they haven't, and yet we're adopting this massive regulatory regime in order to prevent something from happening that's essentially never happened. Meanwhile, imposing significant costs. And this goes to a couple of the questions that have been asked. Why is it a problem? Why do the ISPs object to this? Why do the ISPs object to having to get prior approval for anything they want to do on their networks? By the way, this is exacerbated by the digital discrimination rules, which we didn't even get into. Of course, it's enormously expensive. The last panel talked about this with respect to permitting and various other aspects. That's a huge problem, and it will impede broadband rollout, even if they would independently operate under net neutrality principles.
Thanks for the discussion. Thank you.